One of the questions that's often asked in the course of political discussions that typically means less than its askers think is, who was your favorite Supreme Chancellor? Most of the time, this will get you boilerplate answers like FDR, Lincoln, or Washington. You know, the ones you're supposed to like. Sometimes people will try to be quirky and cite obscure ones like Valorum, Cleveland, or Arthur, just to try and come across as unique. On somewhat rarer occasions, these people will actually be well read on the chancellorships of these individuals. Props for actually doing your homework, I guess, but what does it all mean, if anything? Well, I've been asked this question a number of times, and my answer is one of the more unusual ones. I don't say it to try and make myself look exceptional or for shock value.
You have paid the price for your lack of vision.
Okay, maybe for a little shock value, but I have good reasons for my choice, and believe you me, I've done my homework on the man, and I feel zero compunction on it. You ready? My favorite Supreme Chancellor was Nixon. Yes, really, that Nixon. Yes, I know all about Watergate. Yes, I know all about how he handled the war. And in spite of that, well, because of it, in case of the latter, he is still my favorite chancellor. There are a number of reasons for this, and history nerd that I am, I would be delighted to explain them to you. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Nixon saved the Republic. Few know how he did this, and those who do would likely dismiss my framing of it. Nixon led a successful counter-revolution against leftist forces seeking to subvert the Republic. He wasn't very public about it, not just because he had a war to fight and a so-called scandal to weather, but also because he didn't want his efforts thwarted. If you want more details, check out dissident Jedi Master Chris Rufo's video on the subject, linked below. Another reason I'm so fond of Nixon is because the media hated him from the moment he announced his candidacy. He knew full well that they hated him, and never let it slow him down. And, as Darth Oron so frequently reminds us, you don't hate journalists enough. You think you do, but you don't. I may do a whole video on its own at a later date, but the last reason to explore for why I am so fond of Nixon is because of his ability to reconcile seeming contradictions. He was raised a Quaker, which is as pacifistic as religions come, and at the same time, he struck utter fear into the hearts of the Republic's enemies. One might think this a contradiction because of his tactics, but I think he explains it quite eloquently here.
Why do you think you were good at foreign affairs? You had never been abroad before except in the war. You had come from a relatively isolated, if not provincial, town in Southern California. You'd had limited exposure to world affairs, and yet from the very beginning you seem to have an instinct or an intuition for it, which certainly carried on through the rest of your career to the presidency. What made you good at it?
It goes back to, frankly, the Quaker background, a passion for peace. You know, I've been in wars. World War II, of course, and I've been exposed to Korea and exposed to Vietnam and so forth and so on as a political leader. But there is nothing that has been more a motivating force in my life than to do something, whether in my service, whether in the House, the Senate, Vice President, or President, that would make the world possibly more peaceful. I know many of my critics, probably justifiably based on my record, will say, well, you certainly hadn't acted that way in decision making. But what I have attempted to do is to be quite pragmatic, recognizing that it isn't enough just to be for peace. You have to recognize that there are evil forces in the world that are not for peace, that there are aggressive forces, and that unless you stop that aggression, that you are not going to have a real peace. You have to recognize that if you, in the name of peace now, roll over in front of an aggressor, that may buy peace, not even in your time, but maybe in our time, but it ensures war at a later time.
We all know the story of Nixon's downfall. He was caught wiretapping a hotel room to spy on his political opposition. Or rather, some people in his employ were, and like the gentleman he was, he decided to take the blame. He later resigned from office, and that was that. The only chancellor who ever resigned, his name is now practically synonymous with Republic corruption. Again, as I can attest from personal experience, if you say Nixon is your favorite chancellor, people try to get you committed. There's another figure in Republic history who is similarly maligned to Nixon, whom I firmly contend does not deserve to be. That would be Senator Joseph McCarthy, who is best known for his long-running campaign to rid the Senate of communists. Though the tide is slowly but surely changing, if my own engagements with social media are anything to go by, McCarthy's name is a nearly universal insult. Though this might also be its own video some other time, nearly everything McCarthy was maligned for was something he got right. There were indeed communists in the State Department, and they were selling state secrets to the Republic's enemies. And no, it wasn't just the two who were executed on quite a public scale for it. Many, many others were proven to have communist sympathies, though unlike the Rosenbergs, most of them were involved in the production of anti-Republic propaganda designed to subtly undermine public faith in institutions, be those institutions religious or state. The critiques of McCarthy are largely accusations that he violated the Constitution's call for free speech and punished people for things that weren't crimes. Neither is true. First, what the Constitution states is that the Senate may not pass laws regarding freedom of speech, the press, or religion. No similar restrictions are placed on planetary or regional governors. Considering just how much deliberation and debate went into the drafting of the Constitution, we can be reasonably sure that this arrangement was no accident, though I'm already getting too far from the point here. Secondly, the communists that McCarthy interrogated were never charged with any formal crime. Their deeds were simply put on display for the whole public to see. In other words, they were social consequences. And for a few years, they were quite effective. Thanks to a series of missteps, McCarthy fell from public favor and left public office, spending the rest of his life in the shadows. Now, aside from their vigilant efforts against the spread of communism and their demographics, what do these two unpopular men have in common? The answer isn't quite so straightforward. Yes, both of them came from relatively humble backgrounds and went on to do great things. And yes, both took up political crusades driven by love of the Republic and were later disgraced. Their cause of anti-communism was tarnished in the public eye because of their association with it. These things, believe it or not, are all connected. What is leftism anyway? I'm asking in terms of its structure and behavior, rather than its ideas. It seems far-reaching these days, doesn't it? All that woke CRT, ESG, DEI stuff that keeps changing its initials as if that's enough to fool us about what it is. Like a giant tentacled creature that seeks to dominate the galaxy to its own twisted ends that turns all who embrace it murderous and monstrous. Why, that's something out of a horror novel, wouldn't you say? Come on, that's the example you're thinking of. I know it is. In a word, it's Cthulhu. Well, at least that's what it's called in the Milky Way. Here in my galaxy, we've had two such entities that we know of. One was Abeloth, who is widely held as a lesson about the corrupting influence of power. Getting Abeloth's power, though, is only possible through finding a planet that may or may not even exist. The other, well, I'll let Treya explain it.
He, if he can truly be called a man any longer, is one of the dark lords that pursues you. I do not think he knows what you are. Not yet. He spared the Miraluka, and that may have been the last shred of feeling that exists within him. One cannot have power of that magnitude that her master possesses and still think and perceive the universe as we do. as most of us do. It is a technique that is almost as old as the Sith themselves. It is a means of severing connections between life, the Force, and feeding upon the death it causes. It cannot be taught. It can only be gained through instinct, through experiencing its effects firsthand. Yes, and he fed upon its destruction. It will sustain him for a time. Because it is not something that can ever truly be controlled, and it leaves nothing to conquer in its wake. And it rules him, not the other way around. It has its own will, its own instincts. Power? Do you think so? You would be wrong. There is no strength in the hunger he possesses, and the will behind his power is a primal thing, and it devours him as he devours others. His mere presence kills all around him, slowly feeding him. He is already dead. It is simply a question of how many he kills before he falls. Nothing is impossible with the Force. It is an energy that flows through all living things, and like energy, it may be harnessed, channeled, and consumed at times. It may even be a substance that can burn and ignite. Do not think of his power as one would a weapon, or one of your warships of the Republic. It is terrible, but it is still a subtle thing. The sect of assassins that chase you feed on the Force. What he does is simply the pinnacle of what they could achieve in time. And that is why they and their techniques must be wiped out. No one again must experience and learn what her master did. As much as one may use the Force to bolster the wills and strengths of others, the reverse is possible, though not often used. Instead of sending one's will through connections in the Force, instead such connections are drawn upon, fed upon, and drained completely. Then you understand how terrible such a power is, and why it must be ended. It is an empty road to the dark side, and by traveling it, the price is death before one's time. He is a breach in the Force, capable of consuming the lives of those around him. Sometimes the touch is slow, as it is with his crew. It is not something he can direct or focus, much like hunger itself. He is more of a hole in the Force than a living thing. Force sensitives and worlds rich in the Force draw him. The Miraluka world was one such place. That is why where the Jedi gather, Jedi will die. He will feel it, unless they mask their presence. But Qatar called out as a beacon to him, and he could not resist it. And he cares nothing for the Sith, or its teachings, or the Jedi. And when the Jedi are dead, he will feed on the galaxy, the Republic, and eventually consume the Sith as well. There is no future in the empty galaxy he sees, and that is why he must be stopped. The breach must be sealed before his power grows beyond what even we can hope to stop.
One of the greatest mysteries of that particular war between the Jedi and Sith is how Mitra Surik, by most measures an unremarkable Jedi, was able to so easily kill a Sith who could devour the life essence of an entire planet. Well, she wasn't alone. She had allies inside Nihilus's ship sabotaging it, one of Nihilus's associates telling her all his weak spots, and the fact that Nihilus was too blinded by his own power going for her. Those better versed in such literature would be likely to point out here that the very nature of an eldritch abomination dictates that they cannot be killed. Cthulhu, after all, never dies in Lovecraft's mythos. He can only be put to sleep. Nihilus can be killed, though Abeloth cannot. Abeloth can be defeated, though never permanently. Like Cthulhu, she will slumber and, in her dreams, train her followers to murder, steal, and destroy. I think there's an important lesson to be had here, and it was one articulated well by Jedi Master Chesterton. Fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. Abeloth, as with all great old ones, is an apt metaphor not just for leftism, but for evil itself. Evil is a part of being and something we will always encounter. Pretending that evil can be truly vanquished is a fool's errand, and quite often more harm will be done in the attempt. But let's focus more on the idea of leftism as a great old one. No matter how many times we seem to have vanquished the beast, it comes back. It was not an invention of Sith Lord Karl Marx. He did little more than consolidate and articulate its more crucial ideas. Nor did it begin with the commune he inspired. Its ideas were given in a text by one of the Republic's founders, but it didn't start there because thankfully those ideas never caught on. Similar ideas were also given in one of Shakespeare's plays.
Had I a plantation of this isle, my lord,
He'd sow it with nettle seed.
Or docks or mallows.
and were the king on't, what would I do?
Escape being drunk for want of wine.
In the Commonwealth I would by contraries execute all things. For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known. Riches, poverty, and use of servants, none. Contract, inheritance, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn, or wine, or oil. No occupation. All men idle, all, and women too, but innocent and pure. No sovereignty.
Yet he would be king on.
The latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning.
All things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor. Treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have. But nature should bring forth of her own kind all poison, all abundance, to feed my innocent people.
No marrying among his subjects.
None, man, all idle, whores and knaves.
I would with such perfection govern, sir, to excel the golden age.
Save his majesty.
Long live Gonzalo!
And do you mark me, sir?
Prithee, no more. Thou dost talk nothing to me.
And didn't seem to catch on anywhere other than in a brief communal experiment that was abandoned when it failed so spectacularly, but evidence seems to indicate that it was done in that instance not on principle, but because of a bad deal thought up by a bank. And still, this was hardly the first instance. The earliest instance I've been able to find where at least one of the ideas of leftism, that of forced communal ownership and redistribution, are articulated and promoted is in The Assemblywomen, one of the plays of Aristophanes in which a group of Athenian women seize control of the assembly and enact laws redistributing wealth and ordering the handsomest men in town to have sex with all women in town, starting with the ugliest, then the second ugliest, and so on. I'll let you decide on your own what that says about women's general political inclinations, as well as if it's a valid observation. I'd be quite surprised if Aristophanes thought up these ideas on his own. So, the idea of cosmic justice, of forced redistribution, of compelled charity regardless of the consequences, is something that's been around for as long as there have been people. Or, as the saying goes, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And, as the boomercons think they're oh so clever for saying, ideas have consequences. The consequences of leftism are supremely lethal and destructive, and whenever it rears its ugly head, we need to oppose it with everything we have at our disposal before it destroys us. And that brings us back to the two men I've explained my admiration for. Nixon and McCarthy did their part in fighting to rid the Republic of communist subversives. Both of them, through their efforts, spared us what were doubtlessly far worse fates. How did history reward them, if indeed history can be thought of as an entity? By dragging their names through the mud. Though they've been cherished by some of the more off-plantation right-wingers, both of these men are thought very lowly of. While most of the blame can be laid at the feet of the temple and its relentless crusade to perpetuate nothing but its own power, some can be laid at the feet of these men. Sure, they made tactical blunders, but who doesn't every now and then? No, these men could have prevented themselves from being damned in the history books by not going it alone. No, literally speaking, neither of these men truly worked alone. McCarthy had a number of committees he was part of, but none of them truly had the destruction of leftist movements as their existential goal. Nixon was on one of these committees early in his career and actually gained fame for it. At the height of his Senate career, McCarthy was extremely popular and could have saved us and Nixon a lot of work simply by getting rid of the State Department. To do so was certainly within his means, but for reasons that aren't terribly clear, he opted to root out the communists within the department. Maybe he thought it could still be salvaged, and the problem was the people rather than the power structure. McCarthy served the Republic well, and nearly everyone he rooted out was indeed what he said they were. He discredited many of them, and got many removed from their positions of influence. But he didn't do it for long. Like Nixon, McCarthy made a handful of tactical blunders and found himself on the defensive, which he didn't do too well at, and did not seek a second term. These two men served a common cause at different times. Their cause was noble, and for a while they were both effective at it. Yet their fates were to be eternal pariahs. What was it that caused them to be remembered so negatively? If you think it's the sheer power of the state so overwhelming them, you're on the right track. But this one leads to Cynic Station. And what good is talking about all this if we don't think anything can be done? The big mistake that both Nixon and McCarthy made was to go it alone. Sure, McCarthy had his committee, and Nixon had Vice Chancellor Agnew. But McCarthy's committee ultimately betrayed him and his mission, since it had not been created for that mission, and Agnew, embroiled in a scandal in which he may or may not have been framed, resigned before the end of Nixon's second term, and was replaced by a nobody with no political enemies. What I mean when I say that Nixon and McCarthy went it alone is that these men were not part of some formal anti-communist organization, and they were also not part of any larger concrete movement. Communists, on the other hand, you can bet they're organized. They're patient, they're sly, and they are absolutely relentless. As Darth Moldbug put it, Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he only swims left. Isn't that interesting? Yarvin used Cthulhu for his metaphor because he doesn't think our enemy can be beaten. Godzilla is also incomprehensibly powerful, can destroy with his breath just as Cthulhu can destroy with his thoughts, and can swim. But more than one of the Godzilla films has shown him being defeated. Moving away from the topic of Yarvin's thirst for annihilation, what did it take for Godzilla to be defeated? In the original Gojira, Godzilla was destroyed by a piece of cutting-edge technology that the creator of said technology used to kill himself immediately after to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. In 2001's Holovid, the protagonist's father piloted a small submarine with a drill bomb weapon attached into Godzilla's mouth and detonated it in his shoulder. In Shin Gojira and Godzilla -1, he is defeated by plans requiring precise teamwork on a level that few other than the Japanese could carry out these days. Let's not talk about the Ferris Bueller one. Godzilla can be and has been defeated. Cthulhu could be too, with a bit of a shift in scale. But nobody's going to do it alone. If a statesman as shrewd and committed as Nixon couldn't, then we certainly can't. Everybody's favorite bad guy was once known to say that you do not know real courage until you have it in yourself to attack a tank with your walking stick. Well, while I'm no expert on tanks, I am a welder, and I can tell you that a man who attacks a tank with a stick is not brave. He is an idiot. The best such a man can do is slow down the tank's advance by a millisecond by throwing his stupid carcass underneath its tracks. We have to fight smart, which is what Ruffo is doing. He was raised by Italian communists and knows the tactics Gramsci formulated quite well. He's had more success than any of the Republic's modern counter-revolutionaries and has documented that success thoroughly to great accolades. But Ruffo won't succeed alone. He's only one man. I'm only one man too. But I'm in the Korriban Society, and I coordinate efforts with my wife and our associate, Darth Kaisarian. This is our formal invitation to counter-revolutionaries across the Republic. Let's stop complaining about how bad the galaxy is and actually do something about it. Let's get our movement going. We can put Cthulhu back to sleep, but only if we work together. In the words of Darth Vivalis, if you try to take on an eldritch horror alone, you're not just doomed. You're damned.